How should we treat our dying? From the Greek idea of hospitality to the Knights Hospitality providing care to Christian pilgrims, many civilizations found it necessary to provide for the sick and needy. These beliefs and practices will form the basis of hospice care and its core parts like holistic care. But hospice has not stayed static like it was a millennia ago. With terminally ill patients having to constantly deal with deficiencies in care, each passing century added and reworked parts of the practice, resulting in one of the biggest medical revolutions in the 20th century. This is the history of hospice. In ancient Greece, it was considered a virtue to provide for strangers by giving them food, shelter, and care through an idea called xenia. Temples dedicated to the god of healing Asclepios, called Asclepia, appeared across the Mediterranean, providing care for the sick through practices like meditation, fasting, and dream rituals, where Asclepios would enter into a person's mind. Thinkers like Hippocrates also came up with the idea that the health of the mind and body were connected, encouraging people to examine the whole body when examining diseases. The Greeks not only thought that the spiritual and physical were connected, but also practiced an early form of holistic care that focused on the entire body. Taking inspiration, the Romans also saw hospitality as a sacred and social obligation. As Christianity grew and became the state religion of the Roman Empire, it also integrated previous ideas of hospitality into its worldview. The church now had a religious duty to care for the sick and needy. Early hospitals didn't exclusively focus on the seriously ill or sick. They offered aid to anyone who experienced misfortune. In the 4th century, centers called xenodochia were established, which provided care for the poor, sick, and travelers. An example of one is the Basileas, found by St. Basil. Considered to be the first hospital, the facility provided actual physicians to care for the sick. It was also revolutionary for taking in terminally ill patients, unlike previous sites like Asclepia temples. Hospices continue to see growth in high and late Middle Ages, mainly driven by religious orders like the Knights Hospitalier, as well as monasteries. The Council of Chalcedon set great regulations on local monasteries, making them subservient to bishops. This made monasteries more stable, allowing them to provide better care for the needy. Similarly, holy orders like the Knights Hospitalier were founded to give aid to Christian pilgrims making a journey to the Holy Land. Soon, they would also establish hospice centers. These hospice centers provide comfort and relief to the patient, a precursor to later forms of holistic medicine. To have a good death, the sick were encouraged to become more connected to Christ, while being more emphatic in praying, keeping virtues, and rejecting sin. Similar sites built around Europe by other orders, there being over 750 in England alone during their high point. Hospice centers were not disorganized like in the past. Now they are strictly controlled either by holy orders or the church itself. This time will later be called a charitable revolution, as bishops and monks built hundreds of care centers. However, this growth in hospice was doomed to fall. Starting in the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation spread throughout Europe. The Catholic Church, which maintained these facilities, began to feel a wave of instability. The dissolution of orders like the Knights Templar and the confiscation of monetary land left hospice centers and hospitals without a backer. These centers saw a sharp decline over the next few centuries that wouldn't be reversed until around the 19th century. However, not all was lost. Groups like the Sisters of Charity in the 1600s continued to provide aid for the sick and needy throughout France despite the decline. The Industrial Revolution would see a massive change in the way people saw medicine and dying. Hospitals were increasingly run by physicians instead of priests and were now only taking in the sick. By the start of the 1900s, an increasing number of people were dying in hospitals instead of at home, which was previously the norm. However, that does not mean that the quality of hospitals increased during the 19th century. They often had poor conditions, and many refused to admit patients that were thought to be incurable or that were too poor. People with late-stage tuberculosis, one of the leading causes of death during the 19th century, were forced to look elsewhere. Additionally, doctors sidelined patient needs. Patients were often neglected, treatments were irksome, and doctors viewed patients mostly by their disease and symptoms, neglecting social, spiritual, or emotional factors. As a result, alternatives to hospitals were used instead. Organizations like the Religious Sisters of Charity helped to establish shelters throughout the British Isles, while the Dominican Order of Sisters founded their own hospice in New York City in 1899. Like in the medieval era, these centers were run by religious, primarily Catholic orders that were unconnected to the medical institutions surrounding them. Despite the increase in support, though, many terminally ill patients were forced to live in centers that had poor conditions and were unable to provide effective pain relief. However, Cicely Saunders would change that.
Perhaps first you'd clarify the work of a hospice and how different it is from a hospital. Well, as you said, it's about the quality of life remaining, however long or short that time might be. So it's something that comes between a hospital and a patient's own home, offering something of both, really. But at the point where the acute hospital says, we cannot do more actually to cure this disease, but you do need skilled help to control its results and to give you the best possible life you can have.
Born in 1918, Saunders would go to Oxford University in 1938, but her time there would coincide with the Second World War. Ultimately, she decided to leave Oxford to become a nurse for the war effort. She was loved by the patients she nursed for, and many would ask specifically for her. She said, "We really had nothing to offer them but ourselves and meticulous nursing." And so that really made me realize how important relationships really are. During this time, she saw the significance of focusing on the patient's needs as opposed to the general uncaringness of the doctors. A particular event would stick with her for the rest of her life. One of her patients was a 5 to 6-year-old boy with a cerebral tumor. One day, the professor of pediatrics visited and heard the child crying. In response, he commanded, "I do not expect to see that child when I come back next week." Cicely Saunders and the house manager injected the child with opiates, and he died 2 days later. Saunders found it cruel that the doctor ordered the child be put down without even considering the wants of the child. She would later say that, "I think it may have been one of the roots of why I wanted to do something about palliative care." After the war, Saunders would become a devout Christian. Though originally agnostic, in 1945, she would be converted to Anglicanism during a trip to Cornwall, and quickly began training as an almoner. Almoners distributed money and support to the poor and provided for patients that were too poor to go to a hospital. Here, she continued to realize the social and emotional aspect of the disease. When an early patient of hers died, she remembered it was not only a bit of cancer smell, but also a terrible feeling of loneliness. For Saunders, this is most clearly shown with David Tasma. Tasma was a Polish immigrant who had advanced bowel cancer. Because of his condition, Saunders made it a point to regularly visit him and would go to his ward 26 times in 2 months. With every visit, Saunders continued to learn more about David, from his family to his love interests to why he'd immigrated to Britain.
And there was obviously a tremendous need for him to give some meaning to his life, because here he was, dying at the age of 40 and feeling really no ripple on the pool. It hadn't made a difference that he'd been there. And talking about those needs of his to understand sort of who he was, what has happened, and so on, the idea of somewhere that could have helped him better than the busy ward he was in, good though his ward sister was, sort of grew up between us.
However, David could not outrun time and would soon die in February of 1948. Overcome with grief, Saunders was determined to work with the terminally ill and dying. Soon after, she would apply to medical school and finish in 1957. One of the ideas she had was that of total pain. The idea of total pain is that end-of-life patients experience physical, social, emotional, as well as spiritual pain. These pains are interconnected and can greatly influence each other if not properly cared for. The idea was revolutionary for the practice of hospice, as most regular hospitals only consider physical pain, and, unlike some religious hospices, it focused mainly on how a person's certain beliefs and thoughts could affect the rest of their body. As she continued the work, she became inspired to implement her ideas, and in 1967, she would get her chance. The founding of St. Christopher's was revolutionary for the world of hospice care. Saunders opposed the over-medicalization of dying that ignored the needs of the individual. Instead, she wanted to focus on community and provide comfort to patient lives instead of curative treatments that hospitals did. She combined the best aspects of both religious hospice, modern medicine, and her own ideas to provide the best possible support for patients. Holistic care and total pain were integrated with clinical care and research. She implemented a system where patients would get regular doses of medicine instead of only when they were in extreme pain like most other facilities. Home care was implemented, seeking to return to the practice that had been in decline by the 60s. It was also revolutionary for not being run by religious authorities. It was open to people of all faiths. Her ideas did not remain in St. Christopher's for long, though. In 1963, Saunders went on speaking tour in America. She spoke in places like Yale about her research in end-of-life care and the idea of total pain. She would catch the attention of the then Dean of Nursing, Florence Wald. She began her own study on end-of-life patients and would go to St. Christopher's in the late 60s to further learn about hospice care. When she returned, she was inspired to make her own hospice. Founded the Connecticut Hospice in 1974, the first one in the United States, Florence Wald had spread the hospice movement to America. Soon the movement was spread across the country, becoming mainstream, with hospice care centers flourishing throughout the 1970s. The most significant achievement came in 1982, when hospice care was integrated into Medicare, making it viable nationwide for whoever needed it. In Britain, the 80s also saw hospice further integrated into the NHS. Hospice care will not remain static, though. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross released her groundbreaking work on death and dying in 1969, creating the Kubler-Ross model of the 5 stages of grief for terminally ill patients: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. In 1974, palliative care was coined by Canadian Dr. Balfour Munt for care that was patient-centered like hospice, but that was also for people without terminally ill illnesses. It too would grow and become integrated into the wider medical system. Hospice has gone from being relatively small to a widely practiced field of medicine that is used in most countries, from being run by holy orders, priests, and monks to being a medically regulated and professional field. However, despite the great growth for the once small movement, there's still debate over the changes it's gone through to get to this point. Many say it's lost its roots, becoming just another part of medical practice. Its unique aspects, like its focus on community and holistic care, have been slowly lost through its integration into modern medicine. Another example is the rise of for-profit hospice care in countries like America, as opposed to the non-profit centers that dominated hospice before. In America, hospice has grown to be a $22 billion industry, with over 70% of hospices now being for profit, further representing a break from the movement and causing concern over if these centers focus more on profits than patients. Hospice care is a constantly evolving field that consistently changes from age to age, but we should not only look at how outside emphasis put their mark on hospice, but also on how it's transformed many areas that surround it. Early medieval hospice would set the stage for later development of hospitals and specialized care centers for the sick. The Knights Hospitalier, originally only meant to provide care to pilgrims, became one of the most powerful military religious orders in the medieval world. Groups like the Sisters of Charity would end up being inspiration for people like Florence Nightingale, widely considered the founder of modern nursing. Hospice has not only revolutionized end-of-life care, but also much of history.